Hi, I'm Ed Miller, and I've invented a chainsaw guide that we're going to be talking about today. And before you consider putting a chainsaw guide on your present saw, you might want to consider looking into the other options of other saws, lengths of bar, power of the saw, and so forth, because if you're going to be cutting material that's this big, you may want to consider a different size saw than you might have if you were going to be considering cutting something smaller like this dovetail on this 6x12. So that's the first thing you want to consider. You want to consider your chainsaw size. Is it going to perform for you for a long period of time, or is this just going to be a temporary weekend project for you? If you're serious about, if you're going to be in this for a profession, you'll probably end up with several different size saws. I probably have 6 different size saws, each geared for specific purposes, even with different types of chain on them. So those are all considerations. If you were going to select a saw for just a general purpose, you might shoot for a mid-range, larger than what you've anticipated in using it for, so that you've got some bar length options. So after you've decided what kind of material you're going to be cutting and the power of the saw that you need, now you have to start thinking about whether or not, well, first of all, whether or not you're going to stick with the gas-powered saws or go to an electric saw, such as this Husqvarna 16-inch here. The nice features about an electric chainsaw is, of course, it's quieter. You don't have to hand pull a pull rope to get it started. It's just simply press your guard here and you're ready to operate. So those are 2 very convenient features. The downside is, of course, power, and also if you're going to be doing cutting in a remote area where you don't have electricity, you'll have to use a generator. So these are things to consider when you're considering electric. But certainly the electrics are up and coming. A lot of producers now have these available. This particular saw, we'll be installing some chainsaw guides on a saw just like this one very shortly. But before we do that, here's another size Husqvarna also. It's a larger saw. This saw is too large for the small projects like the dovetail on the 6x12 you saw. This saw, this is probably the shortest bar I use on the saw. I think this is a 24-inch bar here installed with the new EDM Tracer 2 adjustable chainsaw guides. It was previously drilled for a non-adjustable guide, so you can see that that part of it's interchangeable. But this is a shorter bar, and there are other bar options such as this longer bar for this same saw. So you can see that this particular saw, combined with a variety of bars, will certainly handle much larger projects, such as that about a 20-inch diameter log there. So that's what you want to consider, your bar length options, even with the small electric. This particular one, going back to this for just a minute, this particular one has a 16-inch bar as standard equipment. I have used it with some success with a longer 20-inch bar. Because we're using chainsaw guides, we're not necessarily cutting with the entire length of the bar. We're only going to be cutting with a small portion of the bar. The rest of the bar remains unused for cutting, but certainly used for support. So this is the capacity that we'll be continually talking about. This is the capacity of this particular saw, the way it is set up. Now you will note that there are other holes drilled in this bar for some adjustment. I think it looks like we've got a 1-inch adjustment laterally either way. That is to accommodate a variety of fixture sizes. So, but this is the capacity of the cutting capacity of this saw that we'll be talking about. So let's talk now for just a minute about the bars themselves. That particular one, again, a 16-inch bar. We're going to be losing 3 to 6 inches probably because of the nose tip configuration. This one here has a pretty much a solid bar with a roller sprocket on the nose, so we've got to stay out of the way of that roller sprocket. We don't want to be drilling holes out there that's going to interfere with the operation of that sprocket. So we begin to reduce the capacity, the cutting capacity of the saw with guides installed because of features primarily out here on the nose attachment. Usually with a 16-inch bar, we'll end up with about a 9-inch cutting capacity here. And I've mounted these guides. I think we have a 12-inch spacing here. I can go down to 11 or up to 13. So I've got a little bit of a leeway there. We lose about 3 inches when you combine the space of the two guides. So if we have 12 inches outside minus the 3 inches here, we end up with a net cutting capacity of 9-inch. Again, the tip on this larger saw has a hardened nosed piece that is replaceable, and you want to try to stay away from that. I have drilled into them and I have used guides on top of them, but they're generally thicker than the bar itself, so you might run into a different thickness of the nose guide assembly. So you want to try avoid getting out here on this replaceable nose tip. The last thing I want to talk about is back to the bars again. You can have a variety of bars. This one here is, for instance, is installed with a non-adjustable older style chainsaw guide. But one thing, irregardless of the saw size that you have, you want to make certain that this bar is in good shape. You want to make sure that the edges are burr-free from continual use. You want to make sure that there's no bends to it. You want to make sure that there's no warpage to it, because any condition outside of being normal to this bar is going to affect the operation with these guides installed. Now, these guides are going to be riding on fixtures that we will be making. So you can begin to see if this bar is twisted, it's going to want to ride, for instance, off of that fixture. So it's very important that you have a good bar in good condition. You can have used saw, but I strongly urge you to consider just starting with a brand new bar, and that way you'll be assured of error-free operation. And plus you won't be wasting a lot of time drilling holes in the bar that's not really going to provide good service for you. There is some controversy when you're talking about bars about whether or not the bar should be straight or whether it should have some curve to it. There's two schools of philosophy. Obviously, if you're cutting into a workpiece straight on in, the bottom of that cut is going to be relatively flat. However, if it's rounded, once you've achieved a flat condition down here, you may be able to sweep sideways with the cut, and if it's rounded, you can literally hollow ground that flat, which may give you a lot better seat for mating surfaces. So what you gain with the flat bar, as far as having a flat face, may be offset by the fact that you may intentionally want to put some shallowness in there and actually gouge that out for a better seat, a more weather-tight seal, should we say, in the log home business. Okay, another consideration would be on the bars, that the width of the bar. You can see here that these bars will both fit this chainsaw. One is obviously wider or taller than the other. If both bars were of equal length and equal material strength, then this bar here, it would make sense, would be a little bit stronger. So if you're going to be making wide cuts, if you can get, when I say wide cuts, a long distance between the spacing of your guides, if you're going to be making long cuts, a wider bar is advisable to help reduce the flexing of the bar itself when you're making a cut. So there is some advantage to a wide bar, and I think the wider your bar, the more sweeping radius you're going to have on that bar, getting back to the flat versus rounded bar controversy. I tend to think that whatever bar you get is the bar that you're going to master. If you find that you've bought a bar that's relatively flat, you'll get used to it and you'll like it. Whereas if you have a bar that's rounded, you'll get used to it and you'll think it's the greatest thing on the earth. These bars here, just for conversation, one is a slightly wider bar than the other. This one, it would make sense to me, I would assume that this would be slightly stronger than this bar. I've gotten used to using both flat and rounded bars, and I've begun to look for a wider bar, quite frankly. One of the things you might want to consider doing is actually removing these teeth from your chainsaw. They do take up quite a bit of room, and you won't be using them as long as you're using the chainsaw guides themselves. These teeth are generally mounted to the engine housing back here, and they'll take up space in this vital area where we really want to mount this chainsaw guide as close to this housing as possible. So those teeth used to be mounted in here. These are some teeth off of another saw. You can see they're easily removed and replaced if you wish. Now when you go from gas to electric, you're going from a large to a small saw. On this particular saw here and on a lot of the smaller saws, the teeth are either molded directly to a plastic housing, or in this case they are cast aluminum. Well, in this case the teeth have actually been removed already to allow a little closer fitting of this chainsaw guide assembly, the rear assembly, to the housing, giving us more capacity on the bar. So this is where the teeth were. Although they only protruded out about 1/4 of an inch, these teeth here were literally sanded out of the way. We're going to be taking a chainsaw directly out of the box and installing an EDM Tracer 2 adjustable chainsaw guide on it. And we're going to start with this Husqvarna 16 electric. One of the reasons I selected the Husqvarna, which I didn't mention earlier, about selecting chainsaws, is the service program. We've got real good service in this area, and that is something you do need to consider when you're purchasing a chainsaw. So we're going to just take this out of the box. We've got the adjusting tool there. We've got a bar case and a bar. We've got a chain, the owner's manual. Be certain to fill out all your paperwork, and do read your owner's manual. I think you'll find there's valuable information, especially on keeping it serviced. And we'll just set this box aside for a moment. First thing we want to do is to take our chainsaw and go ahead and assemble it. We'll take the case off here. We'll take our chain. This particular chain is a guarded chain, which means we have a guard link in between our cutting links. This virtually eliminates a lot of the problems associated with kickback out when you're using the nose of the bar to cut. Since we're not going to be using the nose at all, I advise using the guarded chain. It is not only safer, I think you're going to end up with a better cut as well. I shouldn't even show you how to put the chain on the bar. You should put it on incorrectly, and then you'll remember probably more vividly. But if you're going to if this is going to be the bottom of our bar, your chain teeth on the top should be going forward, because it's the cutting action as it returns across the bottom is where our cutting will actually be done for the most part. So it assembles in that fashion. Well, one other thing before I put the bar on the housing here. These are the oil holes. This is how the chain and bar becomes lubricated. And you'll see that oil hole is mirror imaged on both sides, so that you can flip these bars over. And with the advent of the adjustable chainsaw guide, like we're going to be installing, that too facilitates flipping the bar over. Also, you'll note here, this little piece of metal right here, this is actually the adjustment, the chain tensioner in this hole. And when we get our case back together, and there'll be a screw outside, and pulling on that screw will actually put the tension here on our chain. So that's what we're going to be doing next. Put the housing on, cover. And at this point, just barely snug that down to where the case, the lid doesn't come off. We're going to turn this around where we can see what's going on. This particular saw has already had the teeth ground off of it. But this is their chain tensioner. If you'll turn that clockwise, you'll note that this chain will pretty soon start, there it goes there. And even the bar is aligning itself. So we're now starting to put some tension on this chain. How much tension do you need? For the purpose of installing the chainsaw guides, it's not that critical. We just want to make sure that we're relatively close on this chain tension. You should be able to pull that chain off the bar, and in this case, it's relatively easy to pull that chain off the bar. So for the purpose of installing the guides, this is going to be pretty well adequate. I'm going to go ahead and just snug this down to kind of hold things in that position. and we're going to turn the bar. I'm actually going to turn it towards you. So when you get your chainsaw assembled, I'd like for the bottom part of the housing and the bar to be facing you. And we're now ready to start installing the EDM Tracer 2 adjustable chainsaw guide. Okay, the standard equipment in your EDM Tracer chainsaw guide assembly are your guide pieces, a 5/32 Allen wrench, and a 17/64 cobalt drill. We'll set the drill aside. We'll be getting to that momentarily. But go ahead and take your chainsaw guides. They'll come, in all likelihood, already pre-assembled, just loosely to keep them from banging around when they're being shipped. You'll see that there are a lot of pieces when you start taking this apart. These, by the way, the guide plates are interchangeable. You can also turn them upside down. This is a Delrin plastic, a pretty durable material. They are also, they may be ordered separately. These are the only parts that are really likely to wear out during the operation of your chainsaw guides. In fact, we'll just concern ourselves with what we'll call the rear guide assembly at the moment. What I'd like for you to do is take one of these two, these are called fences. They're identical parts. We'll take a guide plate and we'll take the front retainer. The front retainer has the countersunk holes. We'll place it in there. The rear retainer has the threaded holes. So this is the part that we want right now. We're going to place that just loosely on the saw. And this is approximately where we're going to be shooting for this thing to be mounted. You'll notice that I have the rounded portion to the rear, and also we want to save some room in here. I'm going to slide that over so it stands up by itself. This, the brake handle here, if this chain were to accidentally or inadvertently get hung up out here on the nose and to start violently flipping, this chain brake would come on, and I'm going to flip it on here. So you'll see that you should try to save some room for this chain brake in its forwardmost position if this happened to be on a workpiece. So we can tolerate this being located in this position, and also when you're just loosely laying it down there in the chainsaw, you want to try to get it a little symmetrically, just approximately symmetrically located here, so that you get a good idea of what you're doing. And also this will be perpendicular to a theoretical center line of your saw. At that point, and also, since this chain, we just put it on, it's a brand new chain, it's fairly loose. When we tighten it up, the chain and bar will actually be moving forward. But if this chain were just, if the rivets and so forth were a little tighter, this chain might cause the bar to be located a little bit to the rear. So you want to save some room in here for that adjustment. So we're just going to put a temporary mark right here with our pencil. And I'm going to remove just that portion so you can see that we do have a mark that we can come back to. So I'm going to leave that on there for the moment and hope it'll stay, it'll pretty much stay there. Maybe not, but that'll be good enough. We're now going to come over here and we're going to take our nose guide assembly apart. Now, since we don't have a fence out here on the nose, we've got these little spacer blocks. So we're going to take a spacer block, a guide plate, and a retainer, the front retainer, and put it out near the nose. At this point, it's arbitrary where we place this, but I want you to pay particular attention to your sprocket. This has a roller sprocket inside. We cannot be drilling into where this roller sprocket is. And also, there's an abrupt change between the arc of the bar here and where it starts tailing off over in this area. So it's a good idea not to get it out too far, comfortably in this range. You may have noticed earlier on the Husqvarna 16 that we were looking at, we had a series of holes out here to give us some leeway. I'm going to step aside here and grab a tape measure. and we'll just get a rough idea of what we're looking at. Our capacity at this, right where it's sitting at the moment, is 9 3/8. That's the distance between the two guides. The outside dimension would be about 12 1/4 or 12 3/8. So that would be the width, the spacing of fixtures that we would make with the cutting capacity of somewhere in the area of 9 3/8. I tend to try and make these an even figure, so that if I want a 12-inch cutting capacity, or excuse me, a 9-inch cutting capacity, and my fixtures are all pretty much set up on 12 inches, then that's about what we're going to look at right there. Leaves a little bit of room here in case I have to go to a larger fixture for some reason. So we're going to be shooting in this case for 9 inches between and 12 inches outside. Since I'm reading the tape upside down, 9 inches in between and 12 inches outside. So at this point now we're going to take and be putting a pencil mark alongside this nose guide. And at the same time, I'd like for you to please note that we're about 3/4 of an inch from this mark that we just put on here to the center line of the guide assembly. So when we remove the guide assembly, we'll have to remember that our hole spacing is of another 3/4 of an inch out here. So now I'd like for you to take and remove all the loose parts, and what we've left behind is a mark out here and a mark out here. We'll then take a tape measure, go across the bar right where that pencil line is, just for a datum. And in this case we've got 2 1/4 inch. What I'd like for you to do is put a mark down the middle of the bar that represents half of the bar width. Go back out here to the nose, do the same thing. At this point the bar is about 2 5/16, so it'll be right about there. It's not necessarily critical. Sorry, it is right about there. It's not necessarily critical what this dimension is, and it's not super critical that this be exactly in the middle, but this gives us a place to start as far as our mounting locations. We'll then take a straight edge, in this case a framing square. We'll align that framing square up with the 2 pencil marks that we just put on the bar, and we'll put a pencil line all the way down through the bar. This now establishes the center line that we're going to be working from. From here, going back to the guide assemblies for a minute, what we want to now do is we want to remember that the spacing is going to be 3/4 of an inch outboard of both of those marks that we just put on, and then we're going to have to be putting a mark that runs top to bottom. So we'll first measure 3/4 outside of those marks. So these are our 2 new marks. That, if you wanted to lay it out on a perfect center, I happen to have here between those a 10 1/2, and that will give us exactly 12 inch outside, because we're adding another 3/4 outside of that and 3/4 outside of this for the guides themselves. We'll then go back to our straight edge, and some means of coming off of this line. In fact, we really don't, with the line established, we don't need the straight edge, but we do need to come off of this mark 90 degrees, both top and bottom. This could be done with another type of square. I just happen to have this triangle handy. So now what we have are the top to bottom center lines, but for each individual guide. The next step is to come off of our center line 5/8 of an inch to the top. And at this point, rather than going 5/8 off of this line, if you had barely gotten off base with this first mark, the critical dimension here is 1.25 inches between the marks. So that's what you really are going to be shooting for. And now you can see these are actually our locations for the mounting holes. 5/8 of an inch here, and 5/8 of an inch here. I'm going to put some large circles around there so that we don't lose where our marks are. And that really is all of the layout we're going to be doing to the chainsaw itself. The next step is to take and center punch these. To do that, we're going to disassemble the chainsaw altogether. We now know that this location is going to work. This is adequate to get us by, because what we're going to be looking at is a 12-inch spacing. That's what we'll be using on some jobs that we're going to go to. So we're going to start from there, but we're going to disassemble the saw next. Now that we've disassembled the chainsaw, we've got it in pieces lying here on our workbench, work area. We're going to take the bar that we already have our layout marks on, and we're now going to center punch where these marks are. You want to try to get as accurately located as you can. This will now help actually control where that drill point gets started, because these bars are pretty hard. And we're going to be using the cobalt drill that does come with the chainsaw assembly. So we'll go in the drill room now and drill these holes. Okay, now that we've had the bars already center punched, we're in here at the drill press. And by the way, a drill press is a much safer piece of equipment to use when you're drilling this bar. The bar is very hard, and the drill is very hard. If you're using a hand drill, be very, very careful when you break through the bar, because it will either break, it possibly could grab and not only break the drill, shattering it, sending pieces flying, but also it might get caught and send the drill turning around and maybe catching an angle or something. So be very careful if you're using hand equipment. I suggest strongly the drill press. We're between 400 and 600 RPM. I think we're at 540 RPM on the drill at the moment. Our cutting fluid is an aqueous solution that's just basically soap suds, mineral oil. In fact, if you look very closely, you can see it's separated here. We've got sudsy water down here, just I think some Joy and water. We have a little mineral oil in here. The mineral oil will actually, when it gets on metal surfaces, just help prevent it from doing some rusting. But when I shake this up, well, this will actually be used as the coolant rather than a cutting oil. Now I can shake that up a little bit. You can see that it pretty much becomes suspended in that water. So and the soapy water itself would be a better coolant than nothing at all. So we're going to use this. We've got our drill all ready to go here. We also have a clamp holding the bar down to the drill press top. I've got a piece of wood in here simply to keep the end of the clamp from marring or scratching the surface of the bar. You do want to try to keep these surfaces clean, because when you're cutting through wood, if you've got scratches and so forth on it, it's going to increase the friction in that cut. So try to keep your bars clean, air scratch free. So we're going to go ahead and drill this. When you're cutting, by the way, just let the drill bit do the cutting, putting a little bit of tension on there, a little water, soapy water. Again, the mineral oil, just try to help prevent the water from rusting the tabletop. There's one hole. Go ahead and get the chips out of the way. By the way, if you've ever worked around a drill press, these chips, I've run drill presses for years, these chips, if you use a rag to wipe the tabletop off, if this drill is moving, you get a rag cut in there, it's a nasty situation. We used compressed air here to clean this. Ready for the second hole. Hole number 3. You see why the clamp is pretty important. And hole number 4. I have drilled these holes out in the middle of the woods with no coolant, handheld equipment, higher RPMs of the handheld equipment. It's not a lot of fun. But that drill now, that bit should be able to drill another bar or two. If I had another series of holes, this drill should be sharp enough to drill quite a number of holes. Again, if you keep the coolant on it, it'll last a whole lot longer. And anytime you're working around equipment like this, you certainly want to wear your safety glasses. Okay, we're going to clean this off, and I'm going to take the bar out of the clamp. And you'll notice that on the back side, it's kind of hard to see this, but there are burrs that have been kicked up. And if you're drilling this by hand, you won't have to look far for the burrs. Several things that you can do to take the burrs off. You can take this out to a piece of sanding equipment. You can sand them off. You can put it on a grinder and grind them off. But what we're going to do, we're going to take the drill bit out, and we're going to put a carbide cutter in here. Readjust our table. Lock it down, reposition the bar. This operation, we probably wouldn't need to use the clamp, but since I'm trying to stay out of the view of the camera, well, we'll just, and we'll put a little chamfer on top of this thing. If you're thinking about using the chainsaw guide for the rest of your professional life, it would behoove you to consider getting a cutter like this, because you're going to be doing a lot of drilling. I've got bars. It seems like in every room in my house. A cutter like this sure makes a nice job out of it. And this is the last hole. So you can see, well, you can't see, yeah, you can see that we've gotten rid of all of our burrs around the holes, and it looks like a pretty nice job. We'll clean the bar up. That's the next thing. Get rid of all of our marks. They're not necessary anymore. And we'll now go back outside and assemble this tool. Now that we have the bar drilled, we've already assembled this onto our chainsaw, and we've already run in the chain, which is, we've tightened the chain with proper tension and let it run for a while, so that if there's any additional stretching to the chain or wearing into the parts that's already been accomplished, then we readjusted, loosened the nut holding all of this together, readjusted that, and we're really ready now to install the chainsaw guide. So We'll go back down here to the saw, and before I forget, one of the common areas of servicing that's normally forgotten is your sprocket tip out here. The oiler takes care of the chain pretty much, but the nose tip out here needs a little shot of grease periodically. Quite easily accomplished. Normally that grease will come squirting out the sides. You can begin to see a little bit of the residue here. And there's a small hole on either side of the bar. We'll service both sides. And we're starting to get some residue off of here. So this is a saw made ready. We'll start by, actually we'll set it up here on this block. We'll start with this side. Take our fence, put it in place here in the rear position. These guide plates are universal. You can flip them either direction. We'll take a front retainer that has the countersunk hole, and we'll drop some screws through those holes there. On the lower side, we'll have the reverse of that. We'll have a fence. We'll have a guide, and the retainer plate that has the threaded holes in it. We'll put that on the bottom side. Take the enclosed Allen wrench. And they're just somewhat snug. You can see that the guides are adjustable up and down. There's some leeway in the hole size. You'll also know that they're protruding through the back. Before we do anything about that, let's go ahead and install the nose guides. Here at the tip. For this side, we've got a spacer, the guide plate, and the front retainer plate. The two screws. And a reverse of the order with the rear retaining plate. Sometimes you get lucky and find it right away, sometimes not. And you can see that that's adjustable. We're going to barely snug that up to where they're not flopping around so much. And at that point, the saw is fully, the chainsaw guides are fully installed. All we need now to do is to adjust these to the proper height in relative positioning to the cutting tooth itself. And you can see we can go, there's an infinite variety of adjustment on this. If we put the holes down the center of a wide bar, this spacing is going to start off differently than a narrow bar. But what we're going to shoot for is about 1/4 of an inch. And if you can zoom in here, we're going to shoot for 1/4 of an inch between these cutting teeth and the edge of the guide. Now that we have all the guides installed, we've already taken one screw here and we've removed the screw and shortened it, because if we turn this over, we'll see that the screws as they're shipped are quite long. We've taken this screw and already sanded it short. You can see that there's no interference here, which is what we want to strive for on all 4 of these mounting screws. We want to have as much of the screw remain intact as possible so that we get a good firm grip on our threaded plate here, but not too much to where it starts scarring up our fixtures that this plate will be riding on. So we want to get all of these short, and we're going to do that by sanding. These are stainless steel screws, and you can grind them, but it kicks up a burr. But I found that disc or belt sanding works pretty well. So we're going to take these screws out and machine them shorter. Okay, we're over here at the belt sander now, and what we're going to be doing is duplicating the length that we achieved on that first screw that was the correct length. we took it out, and first of all, you can get that length by just trial and error. Having installed a lot of these, pretty much know what they are, but you can also, once you've gotten this to length, there are several different ways of measuring it. You can obviously use dial calipers, and this tells me that it's 775 thousandths long, a little over 3/4. 3/4, by the way, is not quite long enough on these screws, so that's again why I've shipped them longer. So this is 775 thousandths long, and that's what we're going to try and duplicate with these other screws. Now in real life, what we would have hoped to do is been able to take one at a time out so that our guide assemblies over there could remain intact. But we'll clamp these with mechanical pliers, vice grips in this case. Turn on our sander. We're going to be using a disc sander here to remove this material, and so I don't have to talk too much over the sound of the equipment. We've got the aqueous solution again here, the same solution that we had in drilling with, and we'll be dipping this to kind of keep the some of the temper in there, but actually keeping everything as cool as we can. So we'll go ahead and try to shorten this. Starting to get real close to our desired length. 30 or 40 thousandths more to take off. And we're within 5 thousandths of what we want to end up with. I'm going to cool this down, make one more little pass on the end to where it's polished looking. And then I'm going to take the screw over here to the flat belt sander and put a little chamfer on the end. And that's our finished screw. And now that we have all the screws the same length, we're going to take and reinstall this on the bar, which we've taken again the liberty to do. And you'll see that now the screws are flush on the back side, and we're ready to start adjusting the saw guides and get them ready to use. So we'll go back down here to our workbench. You can see that we've got the guides reassembled on the other side. All the screws are flush now. So everything on the saw is ready to go. Adjusting the fence pieces, the retainer plates will not move, only the guide plates. And they do move independently. So what we're going to have to discover is a way to adjust them simultaneously so that both of these are straight across from one another. We don't want to adjust them where they're offset. We want to go straight across. I'm going to show you a method that I hope you'll consider, and we'll kind of go from there. This is an adjusting gauge, and if you'll, when you're adjusting the chainsaw guide, if you'll determine where you want to continuously measure from the end of the guides down to the cutting tooth, and you need to get the leading edge of the cutting tooth, not the back side. I elect to readjust each time right at the middle of these guides down to the leading edge of the cutting tooth. And to facilitate that, I've got this gauge which slides over the back side, goes right flush against this side over here. And if you can get to a point where you can hold all that together and just take it right on in to where that dog point set screw. And by the way, this is adjusted right now to where I've got 1/4 of an inch from this face to this flat face on this set screw. So I'm going to hold that in there, and it's going to go right against the cutter tooth, and it automatically, if I've got it tight against the back, it automatically gives me the 90-degree setting for both of these guide plates to be right directly across from one another with. So we're flat against the bottom, we're back against the cutter tooth. At that point, just simply snug it down, and you should have a pretty close adjustment. We'll do the same thing out here at the nose. You get our cutter tooth in position. I elect, if I'm moving the chain, not to go backwards to where I can cut my fingers, but go with the flow of the chain, so if my fingers inadvertently slip off, it'll at least go down the back side of the cutter. So always move in the direction of cut. I've aligned the cutting tooth up in the middle of the guide. Push these out, bring them back in, try to hold everything. Again, I've got that tight against the bottom. And we have our adjustment here. Now, if you change the chains and you go to a different style of tooth, you'll need to readjust. Also, when this gets sharpened, you may want to check this adjustment. You can look, you can set that up there. These will not have to be moved, but you can look in the end and see if this is still touching after you've sharpened your chain. If it is, well, then you're probably in a good enough position to go ahead and start using the saw. There are some other things you might want to consider. We've got the chainsaw completely assembled now, but there was one item that we kind of brushed by. The adjusting screw that on most saws is out forward of the housing is now concealed behind that rear chainsaw guide assembly. So let's go back down to the saw for just a minute, and I'll show you some things that we might be able to work on this with. First of all, you'll recall I'd mentioned earlier that I had taken these teeth off of this particular saw, but also at the same time, before I reassembled, I put a square 1/4 inch machine surface on that screw, so now I can use an open-end wrench on here. I don't have to take my guide assemblies off. There are other saws on the market that have external chain tensioning screws, but this particular saw, I'm so pleased with the way the saw operates. Just simply machining a square head on that screw eliminated a lot of problems as far as taking these off and on. Now I can take the chain off and leave the guides completely attached to the chainsaw bar. So that pretty much wraps up installing the EDM 2 tracer guides. And what we're going to have for you, we're going to have a series of tapes available for dovetailing, for rafter notching, for hopefully some timber framing as well. So I'll see you a little bit later on some of the other videos, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, give me a call. We'll resolve your situation.